Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Best of Both Worlds, Assessments that Help Every Student Succeed, presented by ACT. Just a few housekeeping issues before we start. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to re-watch or share it with colleagues. You'll also receive a copy of the slideshow and receive research and other materials related to our topic today. Watch for an email from ACT with a link to the presentation, slides, and other information in the coming days. You can interact with our presenters today using the panel marked questions, and you can also use this panel to let us know about any technical challenges you're having during our presentation. We'll make time for a Q&A with our presenters during the last 15 to 20 minutes of today's hour-long presentation. We'll do our best to respond to other questions via email following the presentation. My name is Will Vallette from the Marketing Department here at ACT. Our presenters today are Scott Montgomery, Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at ACT, Steve Wojtek, Federal Government Relations Manager for ACT, Wayne Camara, Horace Mann Research Chair at ACT, and Michelle Croft, Principal Research Associate at ACT, who will answer your questions via chat and will join us for a Q&A at the end of our presentation. With that, I'm going to turn today's presentation over to Scott Montgomery here at ACT. Scott?
Thanks, Will, and thank you all for joining us today. You can imagine this is an important topic and an important issue for ACT, and we're glad that you've been able to take a few minutes out of your day to share this time with us. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today's agenda and what we'll cover. There we go. Essentially, we're going to start from the very beginning and lay a foundation and talk about the basics of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, as most of us have come to know it. We want to spend some time talking about the evolving nature of K-12 standards and assessment policies that have been in place over the last several years, how ESSA enables the use of a nationally recognized high school assessment like the ACT to be used for federal accountability in the states, and then talk a little bit about some of the research and evidence supporting the use of ACT for accountability purposes, as well as how the ACT supports post-secondary pathways for students in their academic pursuits, as well as then looking at how ACT is working to support a number of states who are using the ACT both to meet the ESSA requirements for a federal high school assessment, as well as how they're using it in their post-secondary efforts for identifying students who are ready for college and career readiness. So if we think about what ESSA is, I'm going to make an assumption here and then probably break that assumption that I'm going to assume that most people know what ESSA is. Most of us on this call have probably worked with it or been engaged in some form with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for quite some time, but I want to start from a grounding principle so that we're all on the same page. So what is ESSA? ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, is the renewal of the primary federal program that governs K-12 education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or known as ESEA. Most people would agree. You may have known actually ESSA previously as No Child Left Behind in its previous iteration, and I think most people would agree that the scope and the breadth of ESSA over time has grown substantially since its inception under the Johnson administration. And that's probably true for No Child Left Behind, but I think there are some differentiators between what we've known in the past and where ESSA is going. Primarily, I think one of the main components that's similar is that ESSA remains and continues the goals that ESEA has set forth about promoting student achievement and closing equity gaps for our students. But it also seeks to reduce the larger federal footprint that has come to be associated with No Child Left Behind and ESEA in its previous iterations. So how is ESSA different from NCLB, and where have we come from and where are we going to? I think everyone would agree that both of the laws as they were reauthorized have a sound grounding in standards-based reform. And that as we think about where we're moving to, both No Child Left Behind and its previous iterations focused on what I would call minimum competency, right? What students need to know at the basic level. But over time, we also know that states have begun to adopt more rigorous college and career readiness standards beginning in about 2010, and that the focus has really shifted towards post-secondary readiness. And in fact, I think one of the underlying principles of the reauthorization of ESSA was really to make sure that all students were ready for post-secondary opportunities when they left high school. It's also important to note that during this time, over the last 5 to 10 years, ACT has begun to be used by states both in terms of how they measure student readiness for post-secondary achievement, as well as indicators of success under the federal guidelines. And so we want to spend some time talking about how ACT is working with states as they use the ACT as their 11th grade high school test for federal accountability. So if we think about that in terms of assessment, what does ESSA say about assessment? Well, we all know that the requirements for assessment in grades 3 through 8 and at least once in high school in math and reading were continued under the previous federal program, and that at least 95% of the students must participate in the assessments. We also know that students who are involved in the assessment program must have appropriate accommodations and have equal benefit from the assessments that are used for students with disabilities and English learners. That really means that for students who are taking the ACT or having opportunities to take the ACT as their federal accountability test, that not only do they have to have all the requirements and accommodations for English learners or students with disabilities, but the equal benefits portion also includes making sure that students have access to a college reportable score through the ACT. And I think that's an important differentiator to think about as we go forward. And one of the things that ESSA has stipulated that maybe wasn't fully articulated in the previous law. We also know that many of the technical requirements around alignment and accountability are continued under ESSA from No Child Left Behind. But one of the big differentiators that we want to spend some time on today is that how states are now allowed and districts are allowed to use a nationally recognized test like the ACT in lieu of their typical high school or state high school assessment. I mentioned standards before, so what does ESSA say about standards? It's clear that the law makes it very clear that there's a prohibition against the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education, mandating the use of any one particular set of standards. We also know that states have moved from having minimum competency standards to challenging academic content standards and academic achievement standards that prepare students for post-secondary readiness, that those standards are required in math, reading, and science, and that they have to be for all schools and all students, and we can't bifurcate the standards that students may learn in one local district versus another. They have to be statewide. And that those standards also must align to the entrance requirements of higher education in a particular state. And so I think as we think about some of those issues, it's important, and it actually gets to the heart of some of the things we want to talk about how the ACT can be used in a state system for federal accountability. And so I'm going to turn the conversation over to Steve Wojtek, who is ACT's Senior Manager for Federal Government Relations in our DC office, and ask Steve to walk us just a little bit deeper into some of the very specific language and discuss a little bit about the ACT and its use under federal accountability statutes. So Steve?
Great, Scott, thank you. Great overview too, super helpful. As we start to take a closer look at the specific assessment provisions under ESSA, I want to be sure we keep in mind what Scott was saying about the transition from focusing on minimum competency under No Child Left Behind to post-secondary readiness under the Every Student Succeeds Act or ESSA. During the NCLB era, state academic standards were aimed at getting students at least to grade level. As states began to adopt more rigorous college and career readiness standards, this focus really began to shift towards the notion of readiness for what comes after high school. I think this is really a key point to bear in mind when thinking about how ESSA was designed, in what direction it's aiming towards. These standards and associated assessment tools We're at the forefront as states developed and implemented college readiness indicators for accountability systems. And as time went on, these assessments were incorporated into states' wider systems to fulfill the assessment and accountability requirements mandated under federal law. This is a key takeaway for today's webinar, that given this context, ESSA is a reflection of a growing consensus among policymakers that nationally recognized college entrance exams like the ACT can and should be used to assess high school academic achievement. With that in mind, I want to focus more deeply on what ESSA has to say about assessments like the ACT and how they can be used to fulfill the federal accountability requirements that have become a cornerstone of ESEA legislation. So first and foremost, the passage of ESSA formally codified the use of assessments like ACT for this specific purpose. And as I just mentioned, there was a long history of using these assessments for a variety of purposes. So it was by no means a novel concept by the time Congress set about to reauthorize the law in 2015 and include these new flexibilities. And as I'll show in my next few slides, it was the intent of lawmakers to afford states and local school districts this flexibility, a key theme of the legislation itself, so long as they met the same statutory and regulatory requirements of all assessments used under ESEA for accountability purposes. Specifically, there are two options under ESSA to do this. With the first option, state education agencies can choose to administer an assessment like the ACT statewide in order to meet the assessment requirements under the law. In addition to this sort of traditional statewide approach, the law also allows individual school districts to opt to use an assessment like the ACT in lieu of the state's existing high school test for accountability purposes across the state. In either scenario, state education agencies must play an important role because they have to approve or disapprove requests from individual LEAs or choose to administer an assessment like the ACT statewide to meet the requirements of the law. ESSA and related regulation are clear that all assessments, including nationally recognized assessments like ours, must undergo a federally mandated peer review process to demonstrate they meet the requirements of statute and regulation. These requirements apply both for statewide administration of the ACT and when school districts choose to exercise the locally selected option that I was just describing. There are a great deal of other technical criteria and non-technical requirements that assessments under ESSA must meet through this peer review process and as part of the larger obligations stemming from regulation and statute. And while all of these are certainly important, and we're happy to field questions during the Q&A on some of them, the one we're most focused on today is the question of alignment between an assessment like the ACT and states' academic standards. This is arguably the central task of the peer review process, although as I mentioned, they do consider a great deal of other things in addition to this question of alignment. So as I just covered, ESSA provides those two options for using the ACT for federal accountability purposes, that statewide administration and the new locally selected option for LEAs. On this slide, you'll see at the top, I flagged the section and language that pertains to each of these. However, equally as important as ESSA's specific provisions on assessment is language pertaining to states' academic standards. As Scott already mentioned, these standards are wholly developed and decided on by each state. And ESSA goes to great lengths to ensure that states are the ones making decisions with regards to their academic standards in the core subject areas covered under ESSA. In fact, the law actually goes so far as to include pretty extensive language, in my view, prohibiting federal involvement in the creation or adoption of state academic standards. That said, the law does have an important requirement related to alignment of states' academic standards. Drawing our attention to the second bullet here on this slide, the ESSA really specifically requires that these standards be aligned with the, quote, entrance requirements for credit-bearing coursework in the system of public higher education in the state, along with relevant career technical education standards, or CTE. In other words, in order to comply with the requirements of ESSA, states' academic standards must be aligned to the requirements and standards that enable students to pursue further post-secondary education or training. Assessment under the framework of ESSA is therefore not a binary choice between testing either mastery of high school academic standards or college readiness, but rather the law makes clear that these should in fact be one and the same. This is a key message that I really want to leave you all with today, and we'll be revisiting it throughout today's webinar. Before I do that, though, I want to provide some additional context for why this interpretation of ESSA is aligned with ESSA's wider vision for assessment policy. So in addition to the language in the law itself, Congress also developed a related conference report, which provides additional details and insights about the desired intent of the law. This report was developed as lawmakers from both parties negotiated the finer points of ESSA. And so drawing your attention to the first bullet here, the negotiators make clear that allowing states and LEAs to use tests like the ACT for federal accountability was their desire, so long as tests like the ACT continued to follow the rules that govern all assessments under ESSA. Moreover, in the second bullet here, the conference report reinforces the fact that lawmakers consider tests like the ACT to validly measure student performance, something I believe Wayne will be speaking to in just a bit. Again, so long as these tests underwent the same state and federal approval processes as other assessments under ESSA. So in summary, the bipartisan group of lawmakers in Congress who wrote and negotiated ESSA created a separate conference report which speaks to the fact that these new assessment flexibilities were created with intentionality and with the specific rationale of measuring student performance for the purposes of accountability under the law itself. So taking a step back for a second, what were the primary motivators that were really driving congressional lawmakers to make these decisions? Well, first, and something that many of you are already likely very aware of, the main catalyst for reauthorizing ESEA way back in 2015 was really as a response to perceived federal overreach under No Child Left Behind. In the words of many lawmakers, as Scott mentioned, ESSA was and is aimed at reducing this so-called federal footprint in K-12 education, primarily by giving states and school districts more autonomy on a much wider array of issues pertaining to the law. Affording states and LEAs flexibility such as this is also in line with wider concerns around college access and attainment. Increasingly, policymakers have sought to craft legislation that promotes both of these goals. Again, this is an issue that I think Wayne will speak to a little bit more in depth shortly. Nevertheless, this alignment language that I was highlighting a few slides back also underscores the notion that a high school diploma in and of itself is no longer sufficient for success in the 21st century economy. We've known for some time that nearly 2/3 of all jobs by the next decade will require some form of post-secondary education or training beyond high school. Seeking to align state academic standards to multiple post-secondary pathways, including both traditional higher ed and CTE programs, is a key example of how policymakers sought to align and leverage state academic standards used under ESSA and related assessment provisions to help meet this national need. And finally, it's also important to note that ESSA's accountability system focuses on measuring outputs, so things like graduation rates, academic achievement, and other measures of school quality or student success, rather than measuring static inputs. ESSA's assessment provisions in the state and local decision-making that they empower should necessarily reflect this vision emanating from the law itself. So to summarize, ESSA was a project that was years in the making, one animated by a rare consensus that developed in Congress in response to an overly prescriptive earlier iteration of ESEA. Importantly, the law's provisions related to standards and assessment conjointly aim to realize a number of laudable goals that seek to ensure all students can succeed in a variety of post-secondary environments. In the years leading up to ESSA, states embraced new challenging and rigorous academic standards that increasingly reflected the knowledge and skills needed after high school. Echoing these efforts, the standards provisions in ESSA also reflect this reality. The additional alignment obligations between standards and assessment under ESSA and the explicit inclusion of a requirement for post-secondary alignment within these standards, when taken together, pave the way forward for states and districts to use assessments like the ACT for the purposes of federal accountability. And as Wayne will touch on in just a bit, Determining assessment alignment to academic standards is a holistic process, one that should necessarily incorporate multiple sources of validity. Nevertheless, when we consider ESSA's requirements with regards to standards alignment, the statutory language that unambiguously empowers states and districts to use the ACT for federal accountability, and the related conference report providing further justification for these provisions, all of this makes clear that this is a viable option for states and districts to consider, and one that has many inherent advantages as the law continues to be implemented. Moreover, those same sources of evidence reinforce more than ever before the notion that high school should not be a terminal pathway, but rather a launching pad for students to pursue further post-secondary endeavors. As a strong predictor of student post-secondary success, the ACT is therefore aligned with the requirements and overall vision of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I want to stop there. I want to turn things over to Wayne to continue this conversation a little bit more in depth from a research perspective. Wayne?
Thank you, Steve. Let me talk a little bit and repeat a little bit of what Steve and Scott both began with. And ESSA and the final regulations that were issued in terms of ESSA note the intent of the legislation is to require states and districts to ensure all students graduate high school ready for college or a career, which is exactly what Steve said. Alignment is an important component of ensuring that, but alone, alignment itself does not guarantee students will be college or career ready. One could take an alignment and develop standards that do not precisely measure what's required for college. You can have an assessment that's well aligned to standards, but if the standards lack clarity or do not precisely measure college or career readiness, you have great alignment between the assessment items and the standards, but you do not have any relationship to college or career success. So there's really a trilogy of alignment issues that we need to consider. Generally in education and in ESSA, we focus on the second type of alignment only. Do our assessments align to our standards? But again, ESSA and the regulations are very clear about the first and third types. So let me talk about them very briefly. Multiple factors and evidence are required to support a validity argument and to ensure assessments and standards are rigorous, relevant, and of appropriate technical quality. And all three types of alignment are essential and important to demonstrate. So first, standards need to measure the skills and knowledge associated with success in college level and entry-level college coursework or career tech programs. And again, if they don't, no matter how good the alignment between the assessment and to the standards are, the alignment of the standards to the penultimate criteria, college success, career readiness, is missed. And you've got an assessment that measures standards, but is not measuring what the intent of the legislation was. Let me skip over to the last kind of alignment, which is the alignment between the assessment and the college coursework. Again, if your assessment map or content framework captures the skills and knowledge that's essential for success in entry-level coursework, and you develop your assessment to reflect the framework, then you should have tapped this. One indication of how well the ACT does this is a study by the National Assessment Governing Body a few years back, where they surveyed 4-year and 2-year colleges, and they found that the #1 test used to determine placement and readiness for college-level, entry-level coursework was the ACT. Well, it was actually the Compass test, which ACT is sunset, followed by the ACT. So about 32% of 2-year public colleges and over 31% of 4-year public schools use ACT scores for placement decisions in entry-level college coursework in mathematics. Typically, they use scores of 19 or 20. There's often, when we look at the alignment between standards and assessments for other tests, there's often little empirical evidence to ensure that standards measure the entry-level college skills. The analysis is often missing or not stated. For example, the Common Core State Standards have attempted to link their standards to college, and ACT data was actually cited and used more frequently than any other single source of data. ACT is adequate alignment to the Common Core State Standards, but when alignment is interpreted to mean coverage of all or nearly all standards, then the ACT and tests like it may not fare as well as much longer tests that take twice as much time. Or if alignment is defined as depth of knowledge, interpreted as requiring excessive numbers of performance tasks, and open-ended constructed response tasks, again, tests like the SAT and the ACT may not fare as well, but that ACT and tests like it try to avoid over-reliance on these types of items because it increases testing time, often will reduce reliability, certainly increase scores, and there's less reliance on these type of items, quite frankly, in admissions and placement decisions at college. Next slide. The ACT establishes its evidence of the link between standards and college readiness through curriculum surveys of thousands of educators in high school and in college. We have strong empirical data, which follows thousands of students who take the ACT as juniors or seniors, represented across thousands of different high schools. They then matriculate to 2-year and 4-year colleges. They major in STEM, liberal arts, fine arts, business, and we track the students. We determine how well they've performed on these tests, and we link it back to the ACT benchmarks. The language in terms of ESSA specifically talks about equivalence, equivalent or more rigorous than state assessments with respect to the coverage of academic content and complexity. It states that national assessments used in lieu of a state assessment need to have equivalent difficulty, need to meet the same quality standards in terms of validity and reliability, fairness, and other aspects that may be prescribed by states. Tests like the ACT certainly meet these thresholds. The ACT has tremendous amounts of technical reports and documentation and evidence that attest to the reliability of the scores, the validity of the scores, not just for all students, not just for college-going students, but for the national representative samples of students who are taking the ACT. In many states, it has been used as a census test for several years, and we have strong longitudinal data because the ACT test specifications have really not changed in a number of years. Changes and improvements are introduced to the ACT gradually and over time so that the score scale is not disrupted and there's consistency in terms of interpretation. Next slide. And there are arguments for and certainly arguments against the use of the ACT for accountability. One argument we hear quite often is that, well, the ACT was not originally developed for use in accountability, but the testing standards, which federal legislation refers to, the standards for educational and psychological testing, do not say that a test can only be used for its original purpose. Rather, they say that a test can be used for multiple purposes, but that the test developer and the test user need to produce evidence to support all claims and each use. So there's no restriction against using the ACT or any test for more than one purpose, if evidence exists. Another comment about the ACT often will be that, well, it's not as rigorously aligned as a consortia test or a state test, but alignment is not binary. It is not black and white. It is not dichotomous. Alignment is one of degrees. And the testing standards, again, do not single out alignment, certainly, or content validity as the sole determinant of validity, fairness, or reliability. There are multiple sources of validity. And as the test standards say, strong evidence from one type of study, one type of evaluation, does not outweigh the need for additional sources of evidence. So greater alignment, as we know, if you want to increase content alignment, you must have more items. If you have more items, you have a much longer test. There are new alignment methods Ellen Fort and others have written about that take this to task. We won't go into that today, but clearly what ACT is predicated on is not measuring each and every standard, but rather through our data and through our curriculum surveys, we can evaluate the knowledge and the skills that are most essential, the knowledge and the skills that generalize, not just in West Virginia or Washington State or Rhode Island, but that generalize across colleges, 2-year and 4-year across the country. And so the ACT, the content specifications are predicated on privileging and prioritizing the content, the skills and the knowledge that are most essential. Not every skill and knowledge, but only those that are most essential. Empirical evidence is also a strong point of the ACT. The ACT predicts college grades and success. It does so by major for engineers, for business major, for English majors, for journalism majors, and it does so across different types of college. The evidence spans all subgroups, meaning racial and ethnic groups, low and high income groups, public school students, private school students. And so the evidence in terms of the relationship between the ACT content and the ACT scores to future college performance and even career performance through our WorkKeys research is not questionable. It measures the most essential skills, not every skill. ACT is clearly aligned to entry-level coursework, as our studies and other external studies show. But the issue may be with the alignment between the state standards and the entry-level coursework. So if there is not strong alignment between the state standards and coursework, the alignment between tests that measure college coursework may be lacking. Finally, other issues that have been raised about the ACT are it doesn't have the performance levels that most state tests do, or state cut scores. And again, I think ACT has put that to rest. We've worked with many states individually to establish content and policy-based performance levels that describe what students know and what students can do who reach certain cut scores. We've set cut scores with states collaboratively, either using our college readiness benchmark as one piece of evidence for college and career readiness, as well as NAEP data and college enrollment and college grade data. But we've also worked with states that want to set their own benchmarks. And finally, a lack of cognitive complexity or lower depth of knowledge issues are also taken with the ACT, but we've already talked a little bit about how performance tasks are generally privileged for high levels of depth of knowledge, and the ACT does have depth of knowledge 3 levels, but to really provide a strong basis for depth of knowledge and the kind of cognitive complexity that some of the alignment methods prescribe would require many extended constructed response tasks and would result in a test that is 2 to 3 times longer than the ACT. The final slide. There are also some other points that are worth considering that don't address alignment. Some other consequences that result from using the ACT in accountability. First of all, students get college reportable scores. In many states, 60–70% of students may be taking an admissions test, but the students most likely to not take an admissions test are traditionally underrepresented groups, low-income groups, ethnic minority groups, students who are recent immigrants to the country, and these students are dramatically underrepresented in college admissions and college enrollment, and states that have used the ACT for census have both put the students on the radar to colleges and the colleges on the radar of students. Separate external research has demonstrated that students who take the ACT as 11th graders devote significantly more effort to taking the test because it has stakes, it is important. Even among those students who may not initially be considering college, they realize that it's a national benchmark, that it can be important, and they strive in a way that is absent on the NAEP 12th grade test, which has been well documented in research, and state tests. It also shows that there's significantly more reduced testing time, up to 50% of the length of many of the consortia tests and state tests. As we've already said, ACT scores are not only used for admissions across virtually every college in the country, but they're used for placement decisions, scholarship eligibility, NCAA eligibility, and research by independent researchers has shown that states that use census testing increase college enrollment for fairly low investment in the cost of the test. And this again plays out most importantly for underrepresented groups. And finally, there's stability in the test design and the scores over time. The test score, the length of the test, the number of items does not change every 2 or 3 years due to political pressures or market forces. We're able to ensure that scores and equivalence of scores exist across years and, quite frankly, across decades. There are other benefits, such as the increased security of the ACT, where the test is administered both on paper and on computer. But again, we do not keep the same form or the same items out there for multiple weeks, for extended windows of 4 to 6 weeks in length, because if we did, there would be corruption and security issues. We rotate tests, we minimize exposure of items and content to ensure security so that users of the ACT for college admissions, scholarship eligibility have the highest level of integrity, and that also serves to bring greater integrity to decisions about accountability. Let me stop there so we have time for questions.
Thank you, Wayne. We're going to open up the Q&A here in a second. In the meantime, we're going to put up a screen that will allow you to subscribe to one of our 2 monthly informational newsletters, both for counselors and for administrators. If you're interested in signing up for one of those, please go ahead and click that, and we'll make sure that you're added to the subscription list. There's a lot of great information that goes out on each of those newsletters every month, information that you can use on a daily basis in helping students succeed. So we're going to leave that up here for a few seconds. With that, in the meantime, you can use the questions panel there on your screen to interact with our presenters today. We've had a lot of questions that have already come in, and we will start with a question from Maricela, who wants to know of our presenters, how does ACT help English language learners prepare to take a test like the ACT? Is there somebody who would like to cover that?
Well, this is Wayne. I'll begin, and maybe Michelle or someone else would want to jump in. But so first of all, last year is the first year that ACT approved a number of accommodations for students, for ESL students or ELL students, including extended time and localized dictionaries. So there are accommodations available that now will result in college reportable scores. And ACT, one of the differences of using the ACT is that we have to conduct research before we just simply approve accommodations or changes to standardization. Colleges are expecting the scores that they receive of students, whether they're students with disabilities or ELL students or students who live in Alabama or students who live in Oregon. They're expecting those scores to be comparable and that students to take them on the standardized condition and to have comparable validity. And so before we can approve accommodations or changes to standardization procedures, we do a lot of analysis, a lot of research to make sure that the kind of accommodations that we're approving will not somehow advantage or disadvantage any particular groups. And through the research we've done, preliminary at first, and we're undertaking additional research now, we were able to show that these kind of accommodations will assist. So I do think that that and the similar procedures for the pre-ACT are very important. I just say that for all students, an experience in taking the pre-ACT under standardized conditions, and then of course taking advantage of the free test preparation options of full-length ACT online or on paper. Those kind of experiences will help students improve their familiarity with the test so that it's not a new experience on test day, reduce their anxiety. So those are some of the experiences that benefit students with limited English proficiency, but also students, all students in general.
Thank you, Wayne. We had a question from George who asked about the peer review requirement of ESSA and whether ACT or SAT have passed that peer review requirement.
Hi, this is Michelle. So we've had a couple of states that have submitted peer review evidence. We had one state that received their first round of feedback and submitted additional evidence this winter, along with a few other states that submitted for the first time this winter, and we're awaiting formal feedback from the U.S. Department of Ed on that. In terms of SAT states, they submitted for the first time this winter, and we have not heard of feedback from there. And I think that Scott Montgomery would like to add to that.
Yeah, I was only going to add to Michelle's comment, right, that we have received information back from the department on the states that we've worked with on peer review, and I think the thing to remember is that, you know, none of the states have received what I would call a full pass, right, a clean bill of health. Everyone had some level of additional responses that were necessary, and so as we've helped states better align and better support the ACT to their state standards, we continue to work through that process. And as Michelle said, we haven't gotten final feedback on some of those states, but we hope to in the near future. And so we continue to help and support states as we go through that process.
Thank you both. We have a question from Gloria, who wants to know, given the changing landscape, do you foresee less emphasis on SATs, or are SATs part of the mix?
So there are a few states that are using the SAT for federal accountability, similar to the way that states are using the ACT for accountability.
Okay. We've got one from, I'm sorry, I've lost the one that I was going to bring up here. Oh, we've got one from Joanne who wants to know if there are any plans to expand on-demand writing for the ACT, or will there always be an extra charge for that?
So this is Scott. I don't think any of us work in our test development or our product line management group, so I can't necessarily answer that particular question. I think we're constantly, and I may ask Wayne to jump in. He may have a better idea, but I think we're constantly looking at innovations and opportunities to move the ACT forward. I think we've had discussions about what that might look like, but I can't give you a solid answer on that one. And Wayne, I don't know if you can or anyone else can.
Well, the only thing I would add is that what's really interesting is that as K-12, certainly school accountability, emphasizes writing more because it is an essential part of English language arts, higher education seems to be relying on it to a lesser extent, meaning today, my estimate is less than 24 colleges require the writing of either the ACT or the SAT, and that's decreased in the years. One of the reasons it decreased, quite frankly, is colleges are a little concerned that a single essay is not a reliable measure of writing, and they've had no reservations about the multiple choice parts of the tests, but there may be other reasons. So just as K-12 has emphasized the increased importance of writing, we see higher ed placing less emphasis and less weight on it. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I do think that we at ACT are always looking for ways to innovate. Certainly we could, we really feel that in the future we need to look at ways of delivering the writing tests on computer, because generally students who are in middle school today, that may be the only way that they're writing anymore. And so delivering the test in a means that's closest to approximation of what they do in school and at home is probably something that we do need to step up with. And so issues like that, we're always looking at. But it is a complicated issue in changing a test like the writing test for either of the programs, because it involves a lot of changes to school capabilities and testing times.
Thank you, Wayne. We've got a question from Robert who wants to know if there are plans to take the ACT test completely online, a computer-based test, and whether there's any data that shows that the online format is better than the paper-based version.
Well, certainly we've done a lot of research over the years in computer-based testing at the ACT, Quality Core, WorkKeys, and in 2015, the ACT was delivered online, and it's still delivered online today as part of the state district program. So state and districts have the opportunity to administer the ACT online over a 2-week period, and we've just expanded the testing dates. So many of them are doing that. But the majority of students are still taking the test on paper, and while there's a demand for paper, we're going to continue to meet that. We have done everything we can to ensure that the computer is not a better test than the paper, and that may seem strange for me to say, but we do not want a test to be easier or more difficult in one mode or another, because colleges, state departments of education compare scores whether they're delivered on computer or whether they're delivered on paper, and they're relying on the ACT to have strong research and comparability of scores so that a student is not disadvantaged or advantaged by their decision to take it on computer or paper. So many of the things we could do, innovations that we could deliver if everyone took the test on computer, are issues, things that we will not do today. So we're not going to require students to take the test with an online calculator if they take it on computer, or to write all their notes online, because that could actually disadvantage students who are used to using a handheld calculator, or may at least prefer to use that. So we really do our best to ensure comparability if and when capabilities available the schools to deliver the test in the large numbers that we're talking about on one day. We will deliver the ACT to 600,000 students across thousands of high schools. When those capabilities are there, we'll be certain to take advantage of them. But until then, we really do need to maintain comparability of score and high quality of both programs in order to ensure score comparability.
And Wayne and Michelle, actually, as a follow-up to that, we got a follow-up question about where people can read more research and data about computer-based versus paper-based testing. Where would you recommend that people go to find out more information about that?
Well, ACT has a few research reports on our webpage that talks about the issue in general. Certainly Google Scholar, if one were just interested in the topic, not specifically as it relates to the ACT, but just specifically differences in terms of computer versus paper testing, I would recommend going to Google Scholar. Increasingly, one needs to look at research on not just computer versus paper, but look at research on devices. So I've just finished the paper with a colleague that points to some of the issues that that emerge when students take a test on a mobile device versus a tablet versus a computer. And we may assume that they're all the same, but they're not. And so research on comparability generally needs to not only consider the mode, paper and computer, but increasingly now we've got to worry about the device, the screen size, the response modes, how you respond. Are you using a touchpad? Are you moving something with your thumb or your finger? Are you key entering? And all of those issues can affect scores and testing responses.
Okay, thank you, Wayne.
And we also have a chapter in our technical manual that goes over some of the mode comparability studies if you'd like to have it all in one easy to find place.
And we can include a link to that technical manual in the information that everybody listening today will receive so that you can take a look at it there. I've got a question from John Mark who wants to know, can districts decide on their own to use the ACT for ESSA accountability, or must states grant permission?
I got this one. This is Steve, by the way. Great question. So districts actually need to send that request formally to the SEA. The SEA is the one that's sort of in the driver's seat in the locally selected sort of option. So there is certainly a state oversight and role there that's important when we talk about district choice.
Thank you, Steve. Another question from John who wants to know whether ACT provides support for students who are unlikely to attend college but possess a strong work ethic and have a lot to offer to the workforce, or possibly want to pursue entrepreneurship. What does ACT do to help students who may not want to go to college?
This is Scott. I'll take that one. ACT, I think a lot of people know, maybe not everyone knows, ACT has a complete workforce suite as well, right? WorkKeys and the WorkKeys components that make up the National Career Readiness Certificate are also a component of the work we do that helps support students who may not want to go to college, or who may want to go straight to the workforce, or are looking for some other type of certificate that shows readiness for workplace. And in fact, the NCRC and WorkKeys is used by a number of states, including for entry into some CTE programs, or certification as a way to show proficiency in those CTE programs. So WorkKeys is certainly a component, and the National Career Readiness Certificate that is accompanying the WorkKeys suite is a big component for students on the workforce side of the or career readiness side of the equation.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We've got a question from William who wants to know whether does ESSA open the door for the ACT to replace state mandated assessments, or is it more of an alignment to the Ready Graduate Measure? Can someone tackle that? Steve, are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with the Ready measure, but I will say that the provision itself that we're talking about today is in lieu of what the state would have used for their high school achievement test itself. So we're talking about the ACT being used for federal accountability purposes here, both for ESSA purposes.
Can someone speak to the No Child Left Behind versus ESSA? Is there now a greater focus on higher education from the perspective of U.S. education policy?
So this is I'll try to answer that question. I don't think there's a greater emphasis on post-secondary versus K-12 or post-secondary versus career readiness. I think what ESSA has done, though, has provided opportunities for states to provide a great deal of flexibility to the way we assess students and their readiness for, and I'm going to use post-secondary readiness, whether that be a 4-year or traditional 4-year college, whether that be a 2-year training program. I think there's a great deal more flexibility in ESSA that can be used by states and local districts now than there was under NCLB. But I don't, not necessarily sure I'd say that there was a greater or a lesser emphasis on post-secondary or college readiness as composed or compared to like career readiness.
Okay. I've got a question from Robert, who wants to know how does ACT address people who don't believe that there is a correspondence between a correlation between test scores, benchmarks, and readiness for college or career?
Well, I guess I would just say that there's been a lot of research, I mean, literally thousands of validity studies over decades. Some of them conducted by ACT, but the majority conducted by researchers and university colleges that simply look at a student's grades in high school and test scores, and then correlate those with their grades in college. And so the first relationship is does the ACT predict college performance? And it certainly does. High school grades similarly predict college performance, but the best prediction is when you have both high school grades and ACT scores and you combine them. And now you have two very accurate measures of future performance. That is not to say that they're not infallible. There are students, we can probably all think of some, who have excelled in high school and have really dropped out or not performed well in college, or one can make the same argument with the test. Similarly, there are probably students who did not apply themselves well in high school, got by, didn't study that much, went to college and something turned them on and they excelled. So there are always exceptions because we're talking about behavior, and behavior is complicated and it's not predicted like a scientific experiment, a chemistry experiment, where you mix two chemicals and you always get the same result thousands of times. But there's substantial research to show that grades and ACT scores together are the best predictors. The benchmarks are really used as a convenient way to provide, to inform policymakers and to provide data to schools, colleges, and students about the likely success of students. Meaning, certainly a student with a score of 23 on the ACT math performed a little bit better than a student with 21, but both would have met the benchmark. And so the benchmark is really just sort of a convenient way, very summary indicator at best, to determine how many students are on track or not. Again, there are exceptions to these issues, but I would say ultimately the validity of these scores, while not perfect, neither is high school GPA, is attested to by the hundreds of thousands of studies that have been done across different colleges, across different majors, and certainly across different types of test takers.
Thank you, Wayne. And Robert, to answer your follow-up question there, I will work with Wayne to find some of these research reports on the ACT website to back up and expand upon what Wayne just said about correlation and validity. I've got a question from John Mark, who regarding pre-ACT wanted to know whether pre-ACT can be used as a baseline for growth to the ACT test. Wayne, can you answer that one?
Yeah, well, the ACT, the pre-ACT, much like PLAN before it years ago, if you're familiar with PLAN, is in a sense a mini ACT. So the pre-ACT is developed to meet the same specifications as the ACT. The main difference is that the pre-ACT is shorter. It doesn't include the essay, the writing test, and there are a few less questions. And possibly, quite frankly, in mathematics and in science, we may not have the most advanced content in math, because students may not have taken some of the math and science in 9th and 10th grade that they would have taken by 11th and 12th grade. So there are small differences, but we've really developed the pre-ACT to be representative and to reflect the ACT. So a score on one gives you a predicted score on the second. So students who take a pre-ACT, not only are they given a score that goes up to 35, but they're also given a predicted score on if they were to take the ACT a year later. So it represents the same test, the same construct, the same ratio of testing time. So we're trying to make it as much of a low stakes but duplicative experience to ACT test taking as possible. In terms of growth, it's the same score scale, so you don't have to do any other mathematical computations. It just simply would show you may have gotten a 20 and you're likely to get a 22 when you retest it. So that's right there in the score report. So it's a fairly simple and straightforward way of looking at growth for students.
Okay, we had a question from Maricela, who wanted to know from a college's perspective, what's the impact of earning something like a career readiness certificate on college-bound students? If they're headed to college and they've earned a career readiness certificate, how could that help them get into college? Could it help them after college? What is the impact?
I'll begin, and certainly if anybody else has more information on this, please jump in. I would say generally, I'm not aware of any work or any research that's looked at that question systematically. So I would, so what I'll say is somewhat speculative. I would think that many two-year community college programs have certificate programs in career readiness domains, whether it's culinary arts or HVAC. So students who are applying to certificate programs in a two-year college or career readiness technical training program, I would think those certifications, such as the NCRC, may have some influence over not only entry into the program, but also possibly placement into the program. But for students that are going to four-year selective or very selective programs, I'm not sure that I'm not aware of colleges looking at that in any formalized way. It certainly doesn't hurt. The more honors, the more awards, the more certificates students have will not hurt a student in the admissions process, whether it's to Harvard or Berkeley or Michigan State or Iowa. But I don't know that there's any evidence that I would cite that would say that it's used in any substantial way for admissions decisions at those kind of colleges.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. This one's from Jane, who wants to know, excuse me, about concordance tables that compare the ACT to the SAT. What are the plans to release those tables? And are there similar plans to release tables comparing the PSAT to the pre-ACT?
Good questions. So Jane, this is Wayne, and we are at the end stage of research conducted with the College Board to do a concordance between the new SAT and the ACT. So we will be releasing those concordances right about the end of May, 1st of June. So we don't have an exact release date, but we will have concordances that will concord the ACT composite to the SAT total score. We're also going to be concording the math tests and our English and reading to the SAT corresponding score. We're looking at a couple of other concordances, but we haven't made decisions on them. But we will be releasing some of those concordances by the end of May, early June. We have not looked at, and you may be the first one that I recall asking that question about whether to concord the pre-ACT and the PSAT. We really haven't done that. Could we do it? I guess we could, but we haven't received many requests for that, quite frankly, and we haven't thought about doing that. So for the second part of it, I would just say not at this time, but who knows, that could change.
Great. Okay, thank you, Wayne. And with that, I'd like to thank Scott, Steve, Wayne, and Michelle for presenting our webinar today. Remember that you'll receive a recording of today's presentation and a slideshow in the coming days, along with links to research and other information you can use. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Please follow ACT on social media to learn about upcoming webinars, research, announcements, special events, and other information. You can find our social media channels at www.act.org/social. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.